part of our tools and materials section. In this series of DVDs, we're going to cover how to take apart your airbrush and how to clean it. What I want to do is I want to show you the different components and how this tool actually operates. When we get done working on this airbrush and taking it apart and cleaning it, hopefully when we're done, you'll realize that there's nothing intimidating or nothing scary about your airbrush. It's a very, very simple tool where paint is mixed with air and it's deployed. It comes out of the airbrush being propelled by air. And this is one tool that we use to deliver medium onto the surface of our fish. Let's get right into taking our airbrush apart. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different components of the airbrush. An airbrush is a very simple tool. This is one of the Badger Velocity Renegades. This is one of their original prototypes, and we still use it here just about every day in our shop. We're going to talk about what makes the airbrush work, how it works, and the different components that make it function. We're going to show you how to properly clean the airbrush so you'll know how to do that in your own shop. And hopefully when we're done, this will not be so much of a mystery for you. The back half of the airbrush, where it unscrews from the body, used to just be called a handle. This is still a handle, but today the ergonomic factors allow this airbrush to sit more comfortably in your hand. This little back component is a fairly new component in the last decade, and what this is a needle stop. Now basically, if you turn it counterclockwise, it actually pulls this stop back. And what you want to think about with this tool here, this part of the airbrush, is that it works as a tool stopping the needle from going back. So if we turn this clockwise and we turn this all the way in, the needle won't come back. If I open it up, this will give the needle to have some range. Okay, where this will serve you is basically when you're doing some fine detail work or you're trying to create a situation where you need to paint in consistency. This now allows you to do that very, very simply. So we're going to take the handle and the needle stop off, and this comes down to this next little part here, and this is the needle lock. Now if I pull back on this when it's totally locked up, the needle will ride back and forth. If I loosen this, the needle won't move at all. Okay, so in order for your needle to work properly and for paint to come out of here properly mixed with air, the needle lock has to be able to grab this needle in order for it to move. Okay, so that's what this little part is. If you notice, the other thing is that we're working on a towel. If you don't have a towel, you can work on a paper plate or whatever. You can even use a paper towel. But I wouldn't want you to disassemble your airbrush unless you had something in front of you, because there are some small parts to the airbrush and they can get lost. Now we're going to take out the heart and the soul of the airbrush. We chose these particular airbrushes here because I didn't clean them, so we could see actually how we go about cleaning them. This is the needle. This is what allows paint to siphon around it and come out of the airbrush in a vortex. And basically you can see that there's certain areas of the needle that get dirty. Right back here where we can see a little bit of paint, that is where one of the O-rings happens to be in the airbrush. Okay, up here is another O-ring of the airbrush, and this is what stops paint from coming back and flooding up into your needle area here. What we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of thinner, and I have a little bit in this container right here. I'm going to take a little bit of this and we're just going to rub it back and forth. These are just pipe cleaners that you'd pick up at like a Michael's craft store or any store that would sell hobby type of pipe cleaners. And we're just going to carefully clean this needle. You can also use steel wool, and I often do. When you're applying the steel wool, just make sure you go in one direction. If you come down, you could actually bend the tip of the needle, or even worse, stab your own hand. Okay, so that's our needle. We'll talk about when we're working on, because we have a couple airbrushes we're going to show you how to disassemble. We'll talk about the differences, what makes an airbrush a detail brush, what makes one a general purpose. We'll cover the range and the parameter of how they spray and how they paint. The next component we're going to come to is basically the receiver. And this is the big housing body part of the airbrush. And I'll unscrew this back just so far. Okay. And as you can see, I mean, that's basically all it is. what this part does is it holds the needle guide and the spring in place. Okay, there's not an awful lot to clean with this particular part, but if you'd like to, you can definitely take your pipe cleaner and get down in there and see if there's anything in there. As you can see, there's really nothing in there. Okay, if you had paint coming all the way back to here, you have other problems. Your O-rings are gone, or something problematic has happened to your airbrush. The next component is the spring, and the spring is what allows the tension to come back when you deploy this plunger here, which is going to be the next part we go to. This right here, a lot of people call the trigger, but it's really a plunger to the airbrush. And what it does is, as you can see, there's a little depression there at the bottom, and inside the airbrush there's a little nipple that sticks up, and this depression sits right over the nipple, and then there's a little spring that sits down in here, and it's a valve, and that's what allows it to go up and down, and that's what allows air to come into the airbrush. Now the next component that we're going to take out is a two-part component in this case. This is the needle guide. This is actually what keeps the needle in its nice direction, okay? Because it can't really migrate or move side to side. It can go back and forth, but it can't really move up and down. This part of it here is the rocker arm, and this is the component that this trigger sits back on and rocks. And that's when you push down and pull back, that's the part that controls the distance that it allows you to go back. If it wasn't here, then there'd be nothing to push up against that spring. Other than that, we're basically left with the housing or the body of the airbrush. Okay, this is a top feed, or what we call a gravity feed, and the paint would be poured right into here. And as you can see, there's really no additional parts through the body of the airbrush. Now, if we can carefully maybe look down inside here, we can see the components that would make the air valve part of the airbrush work. But other than that, there's really not a lot of maintenance to that piece of the airbrush. Now, basically at this point, what I would do is I would take a pipe cleaner and I'd come down into this little slot opening here. I would just push it forward a little bit and see if we come out with a little bit of paint. And we did. So at this point, I'm going to take my little cup that I have here, and I'll take just a little bit of thinner. You could use alcohol as well. And I'm going to pour some right down the back, and I'll just kind of swish it around in the cup a little bit. Now, if there's still paint residue left over, you'll see it right down on the bottom of that cup. And there is, because we left it a little bit dirty so we could have something to clean. Now, I'll do this one more time. Okay, and if there's any paint that's caught up on my O-ring, this will generally do the trick to get rid of it. As we can see, just a little bit less now. And you could do it a third time. And as you can see now, there's really nothing there. Okay. Now, if you were to do an absolutely thorough cleaning, this is the crown assembly or the head assembly of the airbrush. And we're going to take off with our little pliers here this crown assembly. Gently just get it to loosen up because it sits against an O-ring that's basically pressure fitted. This is why we don't take it off very, very often. Okay. And as you can see inside there, there's little tiny holes that sit in a little circular disc. And that's one of the components that allows air to push through as a vortex. Now, the actual size of the cone that the needle comes through is this little piece right here. And I'm going to gently take that off. I'm going to hold it with some tweezers here so you can get a better look at it. Now this is a piece you do not want to lose, because if you do, your needle won't ride through the front of the airbrush properly. Now, what you do with these little components is we'll just put them in some of our little solvent here. I have a little thinner going on in here. And again, you can use alcohol if you're spraying with watercolor paints, which we spray with both watercolor and lacquer paints. And just let those sit in there just for a moment. Now, if we could look through here, if we could entirely look through here, there's really nothing in there. I can push this all the way through and clean that out if there's any paint or any debris in there. As you can see, there's a little bit of paint residue left over. Okay. So what I'll do here is I'll bring our little cup back. I'll make sure that there's nothing fuzzy from the pipe cleaner left in there. Now I'll sit this vertically. I'll come in here and I'll grab this component here where the needle will ride through. We're just going to stick that right into place there. Okay, I'll take a look at this. Make sure it looks fairly clean. And again, it generally doesn't get very dirty at all. Now I'm going to put this on finger tight right now because I'm going to have to use my pliers here, but once I have air coming through there, I'm going to show you how you can judge how tight this needs to be. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put this rocker arm back into the airbrush. I'm going to hold this vertically so I can push back on, this rocker arm and just hold it into place for a moment. And again, taking my spring, put my spring on there, put this all back into place like this. I'll screw it in just a little bit at first. And the reason why we're only going to go a little bit at first is I want to be able to put the plunger back in. If you screw it in too much, as you'll see, the rocker arm starts to move forward and then it makes it a little bit more difficult to put the plunger back in. Make sure that your opening, okay, on this plunger runs perpendicular with the airbrush. That way the needle will fit through it. And I'm going to feel around here just for a moment until I feel that little spring for the air valve. Now here's something that a lot of people probably won't tell you. If you put this needle all the way back, when you tighten up the receiver here, you may hear a click. Not always, but sometimes you will. Okay, we didn't hear it that time, but the reason why I'm pushing back on this is if you tighten this up without any pressure on this plunger, you could actually get a kink in your spring. And of course, when you're on your last spot on a brown trout or a real pretty fish that you're painting and that spring lets go, you could purge more paint out of your airbrush than you want. What Badger's done that's really wonderful is they've put this little mark, okay, on this receiver, and if you turn this mark until it sits flush with the housing, that's a pretty great factory setting right there for the distance that you want. Years ago with some of the older airbrushes, you'd crank them all the way down and then turn them back about a quarter of a turn. But Badger's gone to the trouble of actually making a little mark that you can put down and find it on your own. I'm going to take the needle, put the needle back in there. Now what I want to feel for is that there's no obstruction. Oftentimes when you put the needle in and it's still dirty in here, you'll feel a grind. You'll actually feel it on the needle when you're pushing it in, right when you get to about where the O-ring is. And what that's telling you is there's still paint on your O-ring. Now what I do is I push it all the way forward, and more times than not, a little itty-bitty tiny bit of debris may come out of the opening, which I think we can see just a little bit there. I'll take this little pipe cleaner and just clean that off. You want it to sit snug, but not so tight that you're pushing past your O-ring, but just nice and snug. I'm going to take our needle lock here, and I'll lock that down. And if I move this back, I should watch my needle move with it. Okay. And we'll put our handle back on with our needle stop. I'll open this up just a little bit. I should hear a nice snap like a spring. And that's exactly what you're hearing. The next thing we would do is we're going to apply some air to this, and we'll test out our airbrush on some paper to make sure that it's spraying properly. What we've done is we've learned how to take apart an airbrush, we learned how to put it back together, we learned how to properly clean it. One of the most important things about airbrushing is how to use the airbrush. As taxidermists or wood carvers, oftentimes when we're learning how to do our trade and to get good at what we do, we often buy tools and equipment that we really have no idea how to use. So what I'd like to do is show you a couple little things that are going to help you become a better airbrush artist. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the actual unit itself. This is the Badger Velocity top feed Renegade style airbrush that we're going to use. I like these top feeds, or what is known as a gravity feed airbrush. And what we're going to do is take a little bit of paint, and I basically don't fill my paint cup any more than about 1/4 cup of paint. And this allows me to basically turn the airbrush just about vertically. And as long as I'm not moving my hand just, too quickly, I'm not going to spill paint out. What this little device is that you can see here sitting right underneath the airbrush, this is called a pack valve, or a pressure air control valve. If I push down, you can hear air. And if I take this valve here and I dial it in clockwise, I can actually control my air pressure right at the airbrush. Now, a question that I'm often asked is, what air pressure do I shoot at? And there's nothing wrong with the question, but the question should be, what does my compressor remain at when I set it? And what I mean by that is if you set your air compressor, let's say at 30 pounds of air pressure, once you hit that trigger, there's something called a drop ratio. So if I'm setting my air compressor, let's say at 30 pounds, and I'm using just a pancake style compressor or a tank compressor that you'd pick up at one of the larger hardware stores, I may drop anywhere from 1 pound all the way to 5 pounds. So if I'm dropping 4 pounds of air pressure and I have it set at 30, I'm really spraying at 26. What I'd rather do is I'd rather set my compressor at around 40 pounds, 45 pounds of air pressure, and then I can control my pressure from my pack valve. And what we're going to do is, if I have too much air or too much air pressure going on, this is called coning. Okay, as you can see, the paint is just separating and blowing out from the middle. That's too much air pressure. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to set my air pressure. Now, after you do this for a while, you can almost hear the sound of it, and it'll look fine. Now, at this point, this is a nice soft spray. If I hold it there long enough, we're going to cone. Okay, but it takes a little bit of effort to make it do that. So basically, if I can spray and it comes out pretty sharp and pretty clean, then that's probably a pretty good air pressure. Now, if we spray this and I turn it down to just a little spit here of paint, see how it spits out and is real fuzzy around the edges? That means there's not enough air coming out of your air compressor. And sometimes if you shut your air compressor off and you're spraying, at first your painting will be just fine, and then when you paint for a little bit, as it starts to run out of air, you'll end up with this. But again, it's probably somewhere around between 28 and 32 pounds of pressure. That's basically where I like to spray at. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I learned to be the secret of the airbrush. What we're going to do now is I'm going to show you the mechanics that will allow you to be a better airbrush artist. There's really two basic principles to airbrushing that allows you to be a better airbrush artist. One is speed and the other is distance. If you can learn to control both your speed and distance in short time, you're going to be a better airbrush artist. I'm going to show you a couple exercises and a couple drills that you can practice at home or in your studio. If we move quickly across our paper plate here at a real close distance, we can get a fairly smooth line. But if we get this close and slow down, as you can see, it's a different effect. The same thing, if we spray really close, this is what happens. Okay, it'll cone out. But if I spray back here, okay, you get a totally different effect. So with the airbrush, if you can learn to control speed and distance, you can get your tool, or your airbrush in this case, to do whatever you want it to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple little exercises and a couple little drills that I want you to practice at home. Now, you can set your needle stop so you can spray more confidently, so you're not spraying with a full blast of air. You can actually control how much air is going to come back with this needle stop. But what we're going to do is we're going to paint a triangle, a circle, and a square. These three shapes are wonderful teachers, and if you buy 100 white paper plates for whatever they cost, $2.99 for 100, if you do 33 triangles, 33 circles, and 33 squares, by the time you're done, you will really be a lot more confident with your airbrushing ability if you can learn to control your speed and your distance. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to teach you how to enter in as you spray paint. Commonly what people end up doing is they'll come in really, really close and they'll start right there. Well, if you did that, you'd probably end up with too much paint. So we're going to come in so I can actually see the paint take place. I can see it start. And from that point, I can slowly move my hand, creating a real soft finish. Now, if I want to fill in some of these lighter areas, I can come back here and I can hold my distance. Until I have a nice soft finish. The same thing with the circle. You can start at any one of these edges, and you can kind of frame in some of these edges here, and then kind of come back and blend into the middle. Very commonly what I see people do, and students when they're here, is they'll paint back and forth just like they're painting a house. That's a technique that you can certainly use once you master it, but oftentimes what will happen is when you learn to start and stop, you'll create something called a dumbbelling effect. And that's because you're doing what they call a hard stop and a hard stop. If you can learn to start and stop without creating that dumbbelling effect, okay, that's a control exercise that you can do. Now back to our circle. Again, I control my speed and distance as I come back and forth. And you end up with a nice soft area. Now when you do a square, you commonly would think that you'd want to go back and forth. But again, I'd paint in my corners a little bit. Notice how I kind of circle and rotate the airbrush a little bit. And I'm also controlling my distance. Okay, we ran out a little bit of paint. So again, no more than 1/4 cup. Paint away from where you're going to paint when you initially put paint back into your airbrush, just to make sure that it's going to do exactly what you want it to do. Now, I left these little places, and these are what we call hot spots. And that's where you've concentrated and hovered just a little too long. But what I'm going to show you is how to clean them up a little bit. Now, I do this using control of my distance. Until I get a nice, neat pattern. So if you practice your circles, if you practice your squares, and you practice your triangles with 100 white paper plates, and learn to control your speed and your distance, you too can master the airbrush. I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial on how to clean your airbrush, how to take it apart and put it back together, and how to do some practice drills that will allow you to be a better airbrush artist. Whether you're a woodcarver or a taxidermist, just remember what I said. It's practice that allows you to get better. I'm Rick Crane, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.